In the United States, we have a somewhat confusing patchwork of elections. We have more frequent and more types of elections than most democracies do. This largely has to do with our federal system, in which each state has a substantial degree of autonomy in creating elections law, and due to our system's weak party structure, in which party nominations are determined by the voters. This video file will clarify the different types of elections and identify how California has adopted some unique elections policies. At a basic level, we can start making sense of American elections by differentiating elections by different levels of government, by different stages of the elections process, and by the rules regarding the involvement of political parties. And we'll start by examining elections by different levels of government. At the highest level, we have federal elections. There are three different types of elected federal office: the presidency, the United States Senate, and the United States House of Representatives. The part of the election schedule that is probably most well known by the American public is the 4-year presidential election cycle. These election years, when the presidential candidates appear on the ballot, tend to attract the most voter interest by far. While other races also appear on the ballot, such as for Senate, House, and state legislative offices, it's the presidential race, at what's called the top of the ticket, that draws more voters to the polls than any other type of election on the calendar. The other type of federal election is called a midterm election. Midterms occur in the middle of a president's term and consist of races for the United States Congress. At the state level, elections are held for governor, state legislature, judicial retention, in which judges appointed by the governor are subject to a yes or no vote of the people regarding whether they should serve a full 12-year term, and the statewide initiatives that we have discussed previously as a major tool of direct democracy in the state. Different states choose different schedules for their state elections. In California, these elections for statewide office, such as governor, attorney general, and secretary of state, have been set to match up with the federal midterm elections. The main rationale for that is that it keeps elections for statewide office from getting overwhelmed by the presidential race. The downside, however, is that voter turnout, the percentage of the eligible population that actually votes, is usually much lower in midterm election years than it is in presidential election years. This means a smaller share of the California electorate participates in the process of choosing a governor than it does in the process of choosing a president. Finally, we have local elections. These are for offices such as mayor, city council, county supervisor, local school boards and water districts, and local initiatives. Historically, most California local elections have been held in odd number years, in what are sometimes called off-year elections. These elections tend to be much lower profile than federal and state elections, and many voters don't even know when these occur. The result is that voter turnout in these local off-year elections is extremely low. For instance, the 2013 election for mayor of Los Angeles, a very important office given that LA is the nation's second largest city, only achieved a 15% turnout. In other words, 85% of the eligible residents in LA did not participate in choosing their mayor. In elections with such low turnout like these, the small sliver of the population that does vote tends to look significantly different from the population at large. Voters in these local elections tend to be whiter, more highly educated, and much, much older than the overall population. In an attempt to address this issue, California recently passed Senate Bill 415, also known as the California Voter Participation Rights Act. This law has the effect of requiring nearly every local government in California to align or consolidate elections for local offices with statewide elections, those that occur in even-numbered years. This will have the effect of simplifying California's elections calendar, with fewer separate election dates for voters to keep track of, and hopefully greater turnout or participation in local races. Another important distinction to make in understanding elections is to differentiate between primaries and general elections. Primary elections grew out of progressive era reform efforts to reduce the power of political party organizations. Prior to the progressive era, party activists and insiders, usually through a party convention, chose who would be the party nominees for the various offices up for election. But primary elections take that choice away from the party organizations themselves and leave it up to voters to decide who will win the nomination for each party and therefore proceed to the general election. Again, each state sets their own rules for primary elections. Some states hold closed primaries, in which only voters who are registered to a party may participate in that party's primary. In other words, only registered Democrats get to select the Democratic nominee, and only registered Republicans get to select the Republican nominee. In recent years, especially as more and more voters have begun registering as independents, more states have adopted an open primary, in which you can participate in whichever party's primary you want, regardless of your partisan registration status. In both the open and closed primaries, there are separate ballots for each party. For example, the Democratic primary ballot would consist of Democrats only, who are competing against one another to win the party's nomination. Blanket primaries are different in that there's a single combined ballot in which all candidates of all parties appear simultaneously. With the enactment of Proposition 14 in 2010, California dramatically restructured its primary elections by adopting a modified version of a blanket primary, in which the top two vote-getters advance to the general election, regardless of party. So in other words, California primaries are no longer about selecting party nominees, as has historically been the case. Instead, they're now a preliminary round of voting meant to whittle down the field to the top two candidates for each office. This has had the effect of sometimes pitting two Democrats against one another or two Republicans against one another in the general election. General elections are much more straightforward than primaries. They're simply the elections which determine who wins elected office. These are the elections that we're probably most familiar with, the ones that are usually held in early November. One last difference in election types is partisan versus nonpartisan elections. In partisan elections, the candidate's party affiliation appears on the ballot next to the candidate's names. These are the most common type of election, and they apply to all elected federal offices as well as most state offices. In nonpartisan elections, the candidate's party affiliations do not appear on the ballot. In California, all local elections, as well as state judicial elections and elections for the state superintendent of public instruction, are conducted as nonpartisan elections. Nonpartisan elections tend to have much lower voter turnout than partisan elections, in part because party affiliation is a very important cue for voters in deciding how to cast their vote. Without party affiliation information, voters have a greater burden to learn about the individual candidates for office. So in the United States, we have lots of different types of elections. Understanding these election types is important for being an informed citizen and understanding the different types of choices you're asked to make as a voter. It's also important because the dynamics of elections are very different by different type. In the United States, in presidential election years, about 60% of the eligible population has actually participated by voting in recent elections. This is low by international standards. Most democracies have higher turnout rates than the United States. However, when we go from presidential elections to other election types, the picture gets even worse. The graphic on the left shows the difference in turnout rate by presidential versus midterm elections. In 2014, only 36% of the eligible population voted in the midterms. And as the graphic on the right shows, The turnout rate for primary elections is regularly below 20%. This is concerning for a number of reasons. As I mentioned before, the lower the turnout rate goes, the less the voting population resembles society at large. The 15% or so of people who would show up to vote for, let's say, a state assembly primary election tend to be disproportionately white, highly educated, and old. Additionally, these voters tend to be more ideological. In other words, very liberal or very conservative, much more so than the general population. This makes it easier for more extreme candidates to do well than they would in higher turnout elections. Low turnout elections also weaken democratic legitimacy. In other words, the sense that people have that the government that represents them is truly fair and legitimate. When so much of our population has opted out of this most basic act of self-governance, we have to be concerned about a system of government that has left so many people by the wayside.